I've kept it for recording. I'll formally start the session once the recording is on.
Okay.
Namaste all. Welcome all again for the session, Sense of Pass towards realizing Rama Rājya. This is 8th session, 4th week of this course. I think yesterday we have been able to discuss some portion of the article, which is Swaraj in Ideas by Krishnachandra Bhattacharya ji. Pranavji will be discussing about the article further today. I think yesterday we completed 13 paragraphs, right? Today we will continue with the 14th paragraph. Pranavji, over to you.
Okay. Namaskara. So we have started looking at the critical aspects about Swaraj in Ideas as articulated by Professor Krishnachandra Bhattacharya. And we shall further look at the points that were discussed yesterday, and also we'll have to look at them with certain different eyes, because the link that I shared with you some time ago actually was something which indicated a seminar which was conducted on the this very lecture by Professor Bhattacharya called Swaraj in Ideas. You would here notice that there are several titles, and in this last article, Remembering the Professor, which is only in the name of Shishir Kumar Ghosh, it's actually a collection of the reflections of several professors and several thinkers of those times, some of who are still, say, alive, and also they are retired and also made significant contributions into the thoughts which are actually provided by Professor Bhattacharya. So we'd see some of these. I would certainly want to discuss some aspects of what Professor Ramchandra Gandhi has stated as the Swaraj of India. So if we have time, then we'd also try and look at the other works which are there, specifically that of Professor Rajendra Prasad, where he has specifically some points to make about the reverence, which we'll get to see that Professor Krishnachandra Bhattacharya asks of us towards our own tradition. So with these brief points, let me share with you the lecture in itself. So we have actually seen, say, what is called by Professor Krishnachandra Bhattacharya as Swaraj in Ideas is that state of being where one is not culturally subjected. And self-determination in politics is what was being spoken of in the days when this lecture was given. And to this day, we certainly believe that we have a certain sense of self-determination in politics. Whether it is true or not is a separate story. But there is indeed a case of cultural subjection that we have been specifically experiencing. And he has indeed given a remarkable articulation of the same that requires due consideration. So we have looked at 13 paragraphs out of the 26. So I'd start with the 13th paragraph so that we'd again say, get back to these, to the thought processes which are there. So a patchwork of ideas of different cultures offends against scholarly sense just as much as patchwork of ideals offends against the spiritual sense. There is room indeed for an adjustment and synthesis within limits of different cultures and cultural ideals. Life means adaptation to varying times and to varying ideals. So this article is certainly speaking of possibilities of trying to look at Swaraj in practice as well. So life means adaptation to varying times and to varying ideals. but we are not always clear about the method of this adaptation. As we have to live, we have to accept facts and adapt our secular life and secular ideas to the times. To what extent we are able to oppose it is a matter of the kind of conviction that we carry, the kind of readiness that we might as well have in terms of opposing the kind of settled sense of ideas and the life and living. So this is something that one can as well brood on, because there are people who might as well say, we aren't concerned with the nature of the times because we believe in something, and we'll wait till the times that the times become conducive to what we are, and we shall indeed strive towards creating that times. So you see, the formulation of a desire for Rama Rājya is certainly present in such a kind of formulation. So though the sense of acceptance of facts and adapting our secular life and secular ideas to the times is something that that happens with people, common people, but if one indeed were to think of being in a position of power, then it does call for us to try and recall that wise words of Kunti to her eldest son, Yudhishthira, that Raja Kalasya Karanam holds. So in what manner that has to be translated to action is a challenge for us to reflect on. So, and that is the reason why, say, this method of the adaptation of the ideal to one's own life is not always clear, and we have an occasion to as well deliberate further, and hopefully, say, this group which forms can find, say, sufficient occasions for such a kind of reflection. We have to alter ourselves here to suit the situation. So that is something that has been happening, and that's a matter of factly statement. But in spiritual life, however, there is no demand for compromising our ideals in order to have a smooth sailing with the times. Here, if possible, and so far as lies in our power, the times have to be adapted to our life and not our life to the times. So on this count, the question can as well be posed, if the sense of Rama Rājya that we indeed desire to, say, live, it must first have a kind of clear picture in our own mind. And once such a kind of clarity comes in the mind, then possibly we can think of what it would be in terms of its translation to reality. So that's something that we must keep in mind. So the spiritual life, there is no demand for compromising our ideals in order to have a smooth sailing with the times. Now, this indeed means that there is going to be a great degree of conflict that one may have to face. And if one is not actually able to consciously think of such a conflict that exists, then it might as well be the case of a confusion. So we'd also get to see these points in a while. So I continue with what Professor Bhattacharya tells us. But the world confronts us not only with aggressive interests, but also with aggressive ideals. So I'm sure, say, those of us who are aware of the kind of changes which are happening in the world that we see, we notice that there are ideals of the kind spoken of in terms of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that are actually presented, or the kind of sustainable development goals that are actually set, which are provided. And similarly, the sense of constant set of ideals that are set towards what is going to be the sense of a beautiful future. So we have a certain kind of aggressive ideal that is being presented before us in variety of senses when we listen to our political leaders. Our Prime Minister, for example, speaks of the new India and a conglomerate of thoughts which actually constitute that new India. And necessarily say some of these ideals might as well be in line with what Professor Bhattacharya calls as Swarajan ideas. And there may be some which may not possibly be in line with that also. How at all do we come to say recognize them is certainly a question. So what response should our traditional ideals make to these imposed ideals? We may respect the new ideals without accepting them. We may attempt a synthesis without compromise, or we may accept them as the fulfillment of our ideals. Different responses may be demanded with respect to different ideals, but in any case, a patchwork without adjustment or with a mechanical adjustment, if complacently accepted as a solution, is an evil, as no ideal here gets the entire devotion of the soul. Where different ideals are accepted in the prayerful hope that a synthesis will come, the patchwork is not accepted as a solution and need not be an evil. There's a very important point that is being stated here, where different ideals are accepted in the prayerful hope that a synthesis will come. The patchwork is not accepted as a solution and need not be an evil. So there are times when one might as well accept many things because we aren't yet clear of how things unfold. There's a prayerful hope. That is, so long as the hope is consciously present in one's mind, that all these different ideals in the minds do indeed find a synthesis. Some time to come when one is more capable of understanding, when say one is indeed with greater effort acquired of such a clarity that it no longer will be patchwork, because the synthesis is actually in the making. So that is to say, when the response of the traditional ideals and imposed ideals comes to the picture, if one were to juxtapose these two, then indeed we might have a patchwork for the present. But so long as there is a prayerful hope would necessarily mean that the prayer is constant. So that is a point that must be kept in mind. But there's a caution that Professor Bhattacharya gives us, which must be heard with care. We talk a little too glibly, perhaps, of a conflict of the ideas and ideals of the West with our traditional ideas and ideals. In many cases, it is a confusion rather than a conflict, and the real problem is to clear up the confusion and to make it develop in the first instance into a definite conflict. I've actually mentioned these two terms a while ago, but I'd like to repeat these two sentences for some more careful reflection. We talk a little too glibly, perhaps, of a conflict of the ideas and ideals of the West with our traditional ideas and ideals. In many cases, it is a confusion rather than a conflict, and the real problem is to clear up the confusion and to make it develop in the first instance into a definite conflict. The danger is in the complacent acquiescence in the confusion. The realization of a conflict of ideals implies a deepening of the soul. There is conflict proper only when one is really serious about ideals, feels each ideal to be a matter of life and death. We sometimes sentimentally indulge in the thought of a conflict before we are really serious with either ideal. The realization of a conflict of ideals implies a deepening of the soul. There is conflict proper only when one is really serious about ideals, feels each ideal to be a matter of life and death. We sometimes sentimentally indulge in the thought of a conflict before we are really serious with either ideal. We speak also a little too readily of the demand for a synthesis of the ideals of the East and the West, E and W capital, in the sense of specific sense of Orient and the Occident. It is not necessary in every case that a synthesis should be attempted. The ideals of a community spring from its past history and from the soil. They have not necessarily a universal application, and they are not always self-luminous to other communities. there are ideals of the West which we may respect from a distance without recognizing any specific appeal to ourselves. Then again, there are ideals that have a partial appeal to us because they have an affinity with our own ideals, though still with a foreign complexion. What they prescribe to us is to be worshipped in our own fashion with the ceremonials of our own religion. The form of practical life in which an ideal has to be translated has to be decided by ourselves according to the genius of our own community. A synthesis of our ideals with Western ideals is not demanded in every case. Where it is demanded, the foreign ideal is to be assimilated to our ideal and not the other way. There is no demand for the surrender of our individuality in any case. Swadharme nidhanam sreyaha paradharmo bhayavaha. I'd like to stop here for a while. If there are any, say, specific questions on this particular paragraph, we'd certainly say take them. I guess then we shall persist with these because I'll repeat a few parts of this statement because there is a reference to the Gita-charya's statement, and possibly this is a very unique way in which the sense of Swadharma is actually being presented, and also to recognize what is Paradharma. And there are a number of factors which are actually brought into this specific paragraph. Please notice that the ideals of the East and the West may not have a synthesis is being first cautioned. And to ask for a demand for a synthesis of the ideals of the East and the West is something that is premature. We have already seen that one of the leading kind of agencies that embraced the sense of what modern India, the turn that modern India took in the ideation of Raja Ram Mohan Roy, was actually to think of a synthesis of the ideals of the East and the West by qualifying East with spiritual and West with the material. And synthesis is basically a marriage between the two that shall bring together the materiality of the West to the East and spirituality of the East to the West, and thereby the entire world shall benefit. That is the kind of a desire with which, say, this formulation came about. And we have, over the past couple of centuries, observed what is the kind of direction that it can take. And in my limited understanding, the kind of satisfaction that it has provided is rather minimal. And I've already brought to your attention that our late Professor Navjyoti Singh used to say that such a kind of marriage which is spoken of is barren because it necessarily makes one forget the spirituality of the West as well as the materiality of the East, and what existed specifically in terms of what worked for each of these peoples of the East and the West, and the historical unfolding of how we have come to the state we are is something that is eclipsed. And one kind of a very important reason why we are to think of sense of past as having a conflict between sense of inherited past that is still in memory or that is out of memory, and the sense of past which is actually acquired by learning from the formal approaches that one finds in history, and contrasted with that which one finds in Itihasa. These are the kinds of points where we get to see that the sense of this distinction which is there hasn't been bridged if we accepted that sense of spiritual East and material West formulation. It is for that Professor Bhattacharya is cautioning us that the ideals of a community spring from its past history and from the soil. They have not necessarily a universal application, and they are not always self-luminous to other communities. So we have indeed taken a look at the Mullah Nasruddin's story of searching for a lost key where there is light. So the luminosity of a certain kind, which is existent, is not possibly suitable to bring about light to that space of darkness where actually we ought to search for, where the keys are lost. So the key point is that if we indeed accept that the ideals are not always self-luminous to other communities, then the kind of acceptance of the ideals of the West that we today seem to have broadly come to accept as a collective, may not be individually or a set of groups of people, then what exactly is the nature of this light, which still makes us believe it to be light, but is not able to illuminate the darkness which has fallen over our own past, is a critical question for us to reflect on. Since the question is about the sense of synthesis itself, should it actually be the case that the synthesis be attempted always? And here comes a very categorical statement from Professor Bhattacharya: a synthesis of our ideals with Western ideals, or for that matter, any ideals other than our own, is not demanded in every case. Where it is demanded, the foreign ideal is to be assimilated to our ideal and not the other way. And there is no demand for the surrender of our individuality in any case. The question of our individuality comes only when we indeed recognize the difference between the ideals of our own as opposed to the ideals of the other. So where exactly does the sense of past come to play? It is in terms of the recognition of our own ideals. And if that clarity does come in, then it is through those ideals that we can possibly recognize that Swadharma which Gita-charya has instructed is something that one ought to be remaining with, even if we are to die in that cause. And that is certainly good, rather than embracing the ideal of the other, because it causes great fear, and the consequences of which we aren't yet clear of, and possibly the consequences shall not be seen in the present. They only get to be seen in future, a future which we have a great stake in. There are those who take this emphasis on the individuality of historical community to be overstrained. It appears to them to be the expression of national, communal, or racial conceit and the excuse of a perverse obscurantism. There's a very important term here, obscurantism. We'll try to explain that in a while. They believe in abstract, self-luminous ideals for all humanity in a single universal religion and a single universal reason. The term obscurantism has had a major role to play in terms of classifying certain types of thoughts, specifically that are treated to be traditional in the public space as obscurantist during the early post-independent era. And when somebody speaks of obscurantism, what it means is that the statement of what people indicate as the ideal is rather misleading, and it obscures from the reality that one is part of. So first, here we are actually even speaking of a obscurantism that has gone perverse. But obscurantism itself is something that makes that people cannot be active participants because people do not seem to make much sense of what is going on, what is being stated. So for example, it might indeed appear for many people as on today to actually find that some of the kinds of things which are stated in Ramayana or Mahabharata appears obscure. It doesn't seem to be gelling well with, say, what our current ways and means of life and living are. And if it indeed also has a kind of strain which is thought of as something that is peculiarly benefiting or beneficial to a particular kind of agenda and to a particular kind of people and to the disadvantage of many others, it actually becomes a perverse kind of obscurantism. So this reference of, so in fact, Professor K.C. Bhattacharya was indeed aware of these things, and he further says that there is this abstract self-luminous ideals for all humanity in a single universal religion and a single universal reason. The abstract self-luminous ideals for all humanity are actually quite popular these days, because the French Revolution's ideals in the sense of liberty, equality, fraternity are all taken to be self-luminous ideals. And also the sense in which, say, the American Declaration, which stated that all men are created equal, is also a self-luminous ideal. In fact, many of these, in terms of contemporary political understanding, are taken to be self-evident truths. And when they are self-evident truths, it indeed means that, say, they are taken to be self-evident. And what is the sense of self that is spoken of? It indeed necessarily not the same as the kind of notion that we in India call as Atman, over which there are a whole lot of discussions, debates that have happened over the past at least, say, 2000 plus years. So the sense of this abstract self-luminous ideals for all humanity added to it a single universal religion and a single universal reason. Now, the call for a single universal religion is consciously, say, being avoided because of the kind of recognition of the strife that it can cause. And that does not necessarily stop some people from still making a claim that the single universal religion needs to be scientific in its formulation. So we do not necessarily find that that reference indeed in what Professor K.C. Bhattacharya explicitly mentions, but one can possibly as well, say, extrapolate to try and look at when we look at the kind of effort that happened in the immediate aftermath of India forming into a republic. There was a conscious effort to try and bring about a sense of scientific temper. It's a different story that when the fundamental duties were added to the Constitution of India, that happened during the emergency days, there was indeed a very conscious opposition to the specific reference of the development of scientific temper alone, because the scholars of those times, that include Professor Jeet Singh Oberoi, whose reference I did make a few days ago in my previous session. So they opposed, stating that this call for scientific temper alone is reeking of scientism, which is a specific form of religious belief that of all the kinds of truths that one finds, that which science offers, the scientific truth, is to be treated as the highest form of truth, and all the rest of the truths are necessarily of inferior quality. So because say there was that opposition, you do find, if you happen to go look at the Constitution of India today, there's a balancing by actually adding a term humanism to it. So the contrast was brought about, but then Professor J.P.S. Oberoi, who was also part of that debates, he stated that even now the formulation is problematic. So if we indeed have to reflect on the kind of fundamental duties of a citizen of India, then it does call for, say, conscious knowledge of the terms that are used and the kind of debates that happened in the past, and also to see how we can as well reflect on the same. Now, the second part about the single universal reason is a enlightenment ideal. The sense of rationality that enlightenment, the European enlightenment has provided is such that what is reason that is identified and nurtured and developed in the during this enlightenment era is something that is indeed taken to be universal, which is one reason why there is a missionary zeal with which the British and the imperialists felt that what they are indeed doing was actually a sense of carrying the white man's burden to try and bring reason to those native communities which do not have reason of their own. So the sense of this universal specification that one finds is something that that again is something which post say the 1960s and 70s, there have been extensive studies. So we have, and that too in the West itself. So within the Western thought itself, people have identified that one cannot possibly speak of a single universal reason, that is the sense of reasoning, rationality. One would have to identify that with many senses of rationality, and there's a very fine book written by an important thinker by name Alastair McIntyre, who actually had a beautiful title in a book which he called as Whose Justice, Which Rationality, where the rationality of how Plato and Neoplatonic thinkers have actually looked at is different from Aristotle, and different from the way in which Aristotle is received by Thomas Aquinas. And within the Western tradition itself, the types of rationalities have been elaborated on. So the belief in abstract self-luminous ideals for all humanity in a single universal religion and a single universal reason is something which is very seductive in its nature. It's so seductive that when one actually refers to the technocentric responses that one finds from the technology giants of the world, where every kind of an issue that happens to be looked at that actually occurs in the world can be translated to that of a engineering problem that can be solved. In fact, that poses a question whether an issue could be indeed treated as a problem that could be solved, or it is something that requires to be understood, and once that understanding comes about, it may get resolved. So these distinctions indeed exist. So the belief in abstract self-luminous ideals for all humanity in a single universal religion and its single universal reason is that being seductive is something that is true as on today as it was earlier, and it would remain to be so, which is one reason why we need to understand what is that case that can make for such a universalism, which is what we will get to learn from Professor Bhattacharya. There is, however, case for universalism. The progress of a community and of humanity implies a gradual simplification and unification of ideals. This is just the rationalizing movement, the emergence of a common reason. We have to distinguish, however, between two forms of rationalism, two directions of this simplifying movement. In the one, reason is born after the travail of the spirit. Rationalism is here the efflux of reverence for the traditional institutions through which customary sentiments are deepened into transparent ideals. Please note notice with care the use of the term reverence. I certainly want to repeat this statement. There are two forms of rationalism which are being spoken of, and one form is where reason is born after the travail of the spirit. When one speaks of travail, any sense of travails, one indeed have to speak of the genuine sense of deep conflict, because the sense of conflict we've already learned is actually an indicator of deepening of the soul. And while it goes through the travails of the spirit, the reason, this sense of emergence of common reason, where simplification and unification of ideals is actually, say, being attempted, and it is facing a great degree of resistance. And that resistance is not something which is a mere resistance, but it is something that comes out of a efflux of reverence and reverence for the traditional institutions. Here it is that some people might say that this sense of reverence for the traditional institutions could be seen as a kind of a conservative appeal to try and think of what we have as something that should not be lost, because there is something of value which is to be preserved. And even if it is taken in that limited sense, it would indeed, say, remain to be a cause for the travail of the spirit. Whether that travail of the spirit has happened or not is what is the key question. So rationalism is here the effects of reverence for the traditional institutions through which customary sentiments are deepened into transparent ideals. In the other form of rationalism, what is commonly meant by the name, the simplification and generalization of ideals, is effected by unregenerate understanding with its mechanical separation of the essential form of the inessential. These are, say, there are indeed, say, terms which are being used which require indeed some reflection, because the sense of essential, inessential call for, say, a great degree of clarity that one can have regarding any system of thought. And similarly, the point for us remains to notice that to simplify this second form, if the travail of the spirit is non-existent, then the simplification and generalization of ideals shall mean that you try and superimpose an ideal and say that that and this are similar, and therefore they are the same. There appears a similarity, and the kind of identification of certain broad similarity is sufficient to claim that they are the same, without going into the detail whether, say, there is indeed some kind of a difference, and whether that difference can make a significant kind of change in terms of how one looks at the way in which the nature of ideal itself needs to be understood and imagined. So the essential is judged as such here, not through reverence, not through deepened spiritual insight, but through accidental likes and dislikes of the person judging. Customs and institutions bound up with age-long sentiments are brushed aside in the name of reason, as meaningless and dead, without any imaginative effort to realize them in an attitude of humility. I think, say, it might as well be fine if I actually gave the kind of current day discourse which is happening with respect to the demand for temple entry in Shabarimala for women of a certain specific age group is also a point where we do find that, say, keep that example in mind, and let us read this sentence a little once again. So the essential is judged as such here, not through reverence, not through deepened spiritual insight, but through the accidental likes and dislikes of the person judging. Now, here the sense of accidental likes and dislikes might as well be something, if we go back to the previous paragraph, the belief in the abstract self-luminous ideals for all of humanity. And here there is that abstract self-luminous ideal of gender equality, which we do get to repeatedly get referred to in many of the current day discourses. The decisions as to what is essential or inessential have indeed to be taken, for time carries not, and mere historical sentimentalism will not avail. So we aren't actually, say, left with options also, because time flies. Time does not wait for anybody. So mere historical sentimentalism will not avail. In practical life, one may have to move before ideals have clarified. But it is well to recognize the need of humility and patience in the adjustment of the world of ideas. Order is evolved in the world of our ideas through infinite patience and humility. I'd like to repeat this once again. Order is evolved in the world of our ideas through infinite patience and humility. That is the right kind of rationalism, which indeed means that the other kind is the wrong kind. It is only in the wrong and graceless form of rationalism that brusque decisions in the practical manner are taken in the name of reason in the world of our ideals. I can repeat, the moment, say, one actually goes about stating that something is right and something is wrong, there's a moral picture that did come in, and this is something that goes beyond mere morality as well, because the issue is about trying to also understand the sense that is actually to direct us in terms of what we think is meaningful way of analyzing situations, because it is the sense of our own reasoning that actually enables us to be making some meaningful kind of efforts towards understanding what's going on in reality around us. To be able to have a description of the nature of the reality that is existent, one must have some sense of reasoning. And if that sense of reasoning and the rationalism that animates the sense of reasoning that is being called for itself needs to be is of two kinds, the right kind and the wrong kind, and wrong one is also graceless, then the caution that requires to be exercised is very clearly underlined by pointing out that order is evolved in the world of ideas through infinite patience and humility. So if it is indeed the case that our desire is to think of that Rama Rājya would be the ideal order that requires to be, say, worked through, and that Rama Rājya as the ideal and the nature of ideal order that we desire, it is something that has to take into account all the kinds of questions that get posed, and infinite patience and humility is being called for. So how far we can indeed say make that effort is something that we can only have a prayerful hope, as we have just read a while ago. There is then a legitimate and obligatory form of rationalism. It is wrong not to accent an ideal that is felt to be simpler and deeper expression of our own ideas simply because it hails from a foreign country. To reject it would be to insist on individuality for the sake of individuality, and would be a form of national conceit and obscurantism. In fact, there is a clarification also being provided. there is then a legitimate and obligatory form of rationalism. It is wrong not to accent an ideal that is felt to be simpler and deeper expression of our own ideas simply because it hails from a foreign country. So there is, say, an openness of ideas that also needs to be kept in mind. So the acceptance of such an ideal is really no surrender of individuality. This is not paradharma, though it might actually find its current expression to be occurrent and received from a foreign country. A kind of story that one can as well look at is when the sense of passive resistance that Mahatma Gandhi elaborated on and stated that he noticed this sense of passive resistance as an idea that he picked from Henry David Thoreau. That's something that might as well appear to be, say, hailing from a foreign country. But indeed, later studies have indicated that Henry David Thoreau was deeply studying of Indian thought, and he picked certain ideas to as well formulate how this sense of passive resistance can come in India. So though passive resistance as a thought is something that indeed started off as a point which is hailing from a foreign country, in closer inspection, and that also has been confirmed through later clarity about the historical exchange of ideas, it turns out to be something that is native, that is belonging to one's own individuality. So there are indeed such instances that one can find, and there may as well be certain other expressions that we get to see of such nature repeatedly that one can find, though its expression is to be found in the current times as hailing from a foreign country. So the acceptance of such an ideal is really no surrender of individuality. To serve this foreign God is to serve our own God. The foreign ideal is herein our own ideal. The guru or teacher has to be accepted when he is found to be a real guru, whatever the community from which he comes. But it is not every foreign ideal that is felt to be the soul of our own ideal. Some foreign ideals have affinity with our own and are really alternative expressions of them in a foreign idiom that has no sacredness for us, and there are others which have no real application to our conditions. I think, say, the reference to the guru here is something that requires due attention. I'd certainly read it once again for us to make some reflection before we move further to the next paragraph, which is indeed very important. The guru or teacher has to be accepted when he is found to be a real guru. So the question remains, how do we distinguish between real guru and fake guru? Whatever the community from which he comes, but it is not every foreign ideal that is felt to be the soul of our own ideal. So the acceptance of a guru from any sense is only something that can happen when from our own side we are actually in a quest. I'm sure, say, some of you would have heard that the kind of relation that one actually speaks of a guru and shishya is of a very, in fact, there are so many different kinds of stories that we get to find from our own tradition, some of which are remarkably, say, insightful in the formulation. So long as one is actually seeking a guru and is genuinely, say, seeking, then it is indeed stated in Indian tradition that the guru actually also is equally seeking out who could be the ideal shishya. So there is that bonding that comes because there is an affinity that is built from both sides, from both ends. And more often than not, if one is not specifically conscious about this sense of the seeking, which is a matter of deep spiritual element in each one of us. The key part might as well be that the persons who are identified as the guru or teacher may not possibly be the ones that one intends to place them in the post of a guru. So so long as this openness is there, then and the quest is genuine, there is indeed a possibility of finding that guru. And we in India still have, say, Avichinna Paramparas, the unbroken traditions. So here the statement is being made in a very generic sense. So in whatever specific sense that we can actually speak of in our own specific context, it would indeed mean that the guru that we look at from whichever country, whichever place, whichever community, is not somebody who is directly violative of the Guru Parampara that we may know from one's own family, if that memory still is alive. If it is not, then it's a different story. So this is itself that actually can give a kind of possibility for a genuine conflict, the sense of confusion moving to that of a genuine conflict. So the acceptance of a guru or teacher, and then trying to consciously relate to a guru parampara that one's own family may still that still has the memory of it, is a very fertile ground for actually experiencing that state of genuine conflict, which can deepen one's soul. So that is something that one can indeed attempt as on today, because we aren't completely lost as well. Some foreign ideals have affinity with our own, but it's not that every foreign ideal that is felt to be the soul of our own ideal. Some foreign ideals have affinity with our own and are really alternative expressions of them in a foreign idiom that has no sacredness for us, and there are others which have no real application to our conditions. A question might as well be asked: suppose there is a foreign ideal which has affinity with our own, but are really alternative expressions of them in a foreign idiom. Should one give the same sense of place to those foreign ideals and treat them as equivalent to our own ideals, is a question that is implicitly posed in it. And by stating that one may not have sacredness in that, is also indicative of a certain sense of reverence that comes when the nature of the expression of the ideal and the essence of the ideal, both of them indeed matter. I mean to say that the form in which it is expressed, as well as the bhava that it expresses, which might as well be the having affinity with some foreign ideal, that the form also matters when it comes to, say, the conscious knowledge that we might have and identify certain foreign ideals which have affinity with our own. And if indeed, because, say, there is a foreign ideal which has affinity with our own, and we embrace the foreign ideal because it indeed has an affinity with our own, then that would indeed go against the sense of individuality spoken of by referring to swadharme nidhanan sreyaha paradharmo bhayavaha, because it is actually a point of choosing an inferior ideal, as opposed to that when you indeed have an access to the real one, to that which is which has the affinity to one's own self, and that is the sense of distinction between respect from a distance and the reverence that one may have for one's own. This paragraph is very important. The 20th paragraph, I'd possibly read it twice. So let's look at it carefully because it does speak of the reverence factor. It is sometimes forgotten by the advocates of universalism that the so-called universalism of reason or of religion is only in the making and cannot be appealed to as an actually established code of universal principles. First point to recognize, every claim of universality, when you first come across, it hasn't yet included you in that possibility. So it is only in the making. There might be people who might have a belief, a faith that what they are advocating is actually indeed universal. But there may be genuine people who find it to be completely averse to their own life, living and being. So this is a fairly truth which is staring at us, but more often than not, the advocacy takes over than the acceptance of reality. I repeat the sentence, it's sometimes forgotten by the advocates of universalism, possibly sometimes is a misnomer, it is probably always forgotten by the advocates of universalism, that the so-called universalism of reason or of religion is only in the making and cannot be appealed to an actually established code of universal principles. What is universal is only the spirit, the loyalty to our own ideals and the openness to other ideals, the determination not to reject them if they are found within our ideals and not to accept them till they are so found. Please notice the particularity of, say, this statement also. What is universal is only the spirit, the loyalty to our own ideals. So we might say we are loyal to our ideals. Somebody else might say they are loyal to their ideals. And therefore, that loyalty factor becomes universal. And the openness to other ideals, because when we actually get across ideals of somebody else, unless we are in a position to have openness to look at it, we would not be in a position to adjudicate whether they are having an affinity to ours, they have no affinity, they fall within the scope of our ideals, they can be accepted, they can be rejected or not. This clarity can come only when there is that sense of openness. And the determination not to reject them if they are found within our ideals and not to accept them till they are so found. So Professor Krishnachandra Bhattacharya has actually given a very fine kind of a formulation of what can be universal. And you would notice that in another instance, I'd probably share that specific quotation with you. He speaks of what can be universal by taking an example like that of Panini's Ashtadhyayi. So if in case Panini's Ashtadhyayi is to be taken as an exemplification of universal grammar that can be provided to all of Sanskrit language, then those who are aware of the way in which Ashtadhyayi is constructed, you would find that there are sutras which are generic in their formulation, which actually deal with, say, the vast generality of the nature of word formation in Sanskrit, and there are exception rules to it. So you have general rules and there are exception rules. So if you have a universal system that is ever offered, unless and until it actually gives you a set of general rules and also provide within the scope of the system an explicit mention of what are the exceptions, only such a system can ever be universal. This is a very deep insight that one can apply in very many situations. I do not right away have the quotation with me, but I do intend to share that with you because it's quite insightful. So the universal reasoning also is to be such that the clarity about the general instances where it is applicable and the exceptions where it is not to be applied is also to be explicit. Only such a system can actually be can actually claim to be a system of universal reasoning, universal rationality. So let me repeat this important sentence again. What is universal is only the spirit, the loyalty to our own ideals, and the openness to other ideals, the determination not to reject them if they are found within our ideals and not to accept them till they are so found. It is important for me to spend some time on the question of loyalty. Why should there be a loyalty to one's own ideals? Now, let me give, I think I did refer to say this lecture by Professor Bhikkhu Parekh on Swaraj in ideas and specifically in the context of Mahatma Gandhi. So Mahatma Gandhi's Hind Swaraj. So Swaraj in ideas and Gandhi is a, if you look at in the YouTube, you would find that speech which is given by Professor Bhikkhu Parekh. He makes a very important observation that there are many things that Mahatma Gandhi said, but one thing that sounds very peculiar to our mind in current times is that he insists that because you are born in a place, you must be loyal to the place where you're born. And that loyalty is something that he considers as a ground principle to apply in almost all aspects of his own reasoning and his expression. So where exactly can one understand this sense of loyalty that is spoken of? So Professor Parekh actually points out that if you are a Hindu and believe that, say, there is a causality that is associated with your being born in a place, because you have done such karma so as to be born in a place. So it is that karma which actually, the entailment of such karma is what obligates you to have that loyalty. Now, if you actually are somebody who is considering that your own being born at a particular place is a happenstance, is basically a coincidence. It so happened. Let us say that there are many foreign couples who might come to India and they might have thought, let's say during the pandemic times, they came to India and let's say pandemic has been for almost a year now, and they decided to beget a child, and they didn't find a way out to go back to their home, given the kind of conditions that the pandemic has imposed. So it might as well be possible for them to think that it's a coincidence that their child was born in India. Now, and if they are, let's say, of the agnostic, atheistic kind, then they'd only mention that it's a happenstance. So happened that I was there, so therefore, and there was this pandemic, so I was actually forced to have a delivery in India. Now, let us actually try and understand, say, this specific instance, whether the child who is born to these foreign parents in India because of this happenstance, should such a person also carry the loyalty to the place where he or she is born? If you actually look at it from the Hindu standpoint, you would indeed say that there must be a reason why that happened to be so. Now, I thought for a while, if I were to ask for this sense of loyalty from, let's say, someone belonging to Islam, can that be stated? Maybe there is a possibility. I mean, for all those religions who believe that there is a God above, and there is, and God is the singular cause for all occurrences in the world, there's a sense by which one can say that because God decided that I be born here, I was born. So at least that possibility is there. So therefore, I must respect God's decision. So there is a possibility of loyalty that can be spoken of in almost all religions which have this acceptance of God. Then there is the say if there's no God, but still karma is accepted, we already have a causality which is in place. So Buddhist is also considered. How do we actually talk about the happenstance point? I mean, if I take it in the Charvaka sense, there is a possibility of actually stating that a person who is a Charvaka would not possibly like to make a great kind of effort. So I was born here, so therefore, why should I indeed try and make a great degree of effort to change my my own location or to think of something else? So even that sense is possibly a point which can have a sense of loyalty, and from there one can possibly build a community that is surrounding. So therefore, say you find that you are part of that community, and that community recognizes some things, and without your knowledge, you might as well start accepting them. So there may be that loyalty that gets built, even in the case of happenstance in such an instance. So I've just opened up the possibility of trying to understand the sense of loyalty, because many people might as well challenge this question about why at all should I have loyalty to this specific underlining of our own ideals. And there are people, in fact, who did try and contest this by saying that if one were to be truly questioning, truly rational, then one should indeed challenge every aspect of life, including, say, what is called as one's own. And we cannot possibly claim that our own is of a greater kind than some other ideal, which indeed, of course, goes against the Swadharme Nidhanam Sreyaha formulation. But there are people who would actually point that out, and there are questions of this kind that you find amongst the reflections on this specific lecture by various professors, which you can read in the other sections that I've actually read out. So the sense of this loyalty that is being called for is something that is very important, and there's a great degree of discussion that can happen on it. I'd leave it at this stage, and we shall further progress in this 20th paragraph. The only way to appraise a new ideal is to view it through our actual ideal. And the actual ideal is that which is stated to be our own. And our own is something that comes with a certain factor of loyalty. All these are, say, loaded onto it. The only way to find a new reverence is to deepen our old reverence. Now, please notice, the only way to find a new reverence is to deepen our old reverence. Now, this may not appear to be something that that actually is as easy to comprehend as well. even if there are people who in turn try to embrace a new ideal, they may not possibly notice it, but they are probably ending up deepening their old reverence. So the conscious appeal to try and embrace something new would actually force one to try and increase the sense of reverence that we have of the older kind. There are, of course, several instances that one can find, and possibly none more so than the peculiar kind of experience that one may have if one finds a person who has converted from one religion to another. I am deliberately bringing to your attention the focus on the process of conversion and what it is and what does it mean in the deeper sense. It is a different story that it's a politically hot topic in these days to speak of the varieties of conversions that happen in the country because of enticements. But I am actually speaking of the very idea of conversion, if at all it ever occurs deeply in a spirit, then such a thing, what does it actually mean, is a question to be pondered on. Progress in the spiritual world is not achieved by a detached reason judging between an old God and a new God. The way to know facts is not the way to know values. Now, this distinction between facts and values is also something that many people have actually tried to question, because facts by themselves are not something that are readily available. So Professor Bhattacharya, by distinguishing facts and values, is possibly making a dichotomy, but one need not actually take it to be a dichotomy also if one indeed understands that the sense of those that we accept as facts are those that are built on certain accepted values which are ingrained. And when you are actually trying to know something of a new value, then that calls for a different engagement. So it is in this way that one can as well look at the sense of the distinction between facts and the values that are actually referred to in here. Having spent some time, I now read this paragraph without any explanation, and then we'll move further to the next paragraph. It is sometimes forgotten by the advocates of universalism that the so-called universalism of reason or of religion is only in the making and cannot be appealed to as an actually established code of universal principles. What is universal is only the spirit, the loyalty to our own ideals and the openness to other ideals, the determination not to reject them if they are found within our ideals and not to accept them till they are so found. The only way to appraise a new ideal is to view it through our actual ideal. The only way to find a new reverence is to deepen our old reverence. Progress in the spiritual world is not achieved by a detached reason, judging between an old God and a new God. The way to know facts is not the way to know values. So much for the objection, which is often raised in the name of universalism, to the stress I have laid on the individuality of Indian thought and spirit, on the conservatism of the distinctive values evolved through ages of continuous historical life of Indian society. I have thought it necessary to examine universalism in some detail at the risk of tiring the reader with abstract arguments, because this appears to me to be our greatest danger. It is the inevitable result of our quote-unquote rootless education, and it stands more than anything else in the way of what I call Swaraj in ideas. Now, if I actually say accept this last paragraph, I can go back to the previous paragraph and say that the possibility of embracing a new ideal without considering the old ideal would never have occurred if at all there wasn't a state of affairs where the nature of education that is imparted itself has become rootless. If this situation weren't there, then the only way to find a new reverence is to deepen our old reverence would actually hold as an axiomatic truth. But in the presence of a rootless education, we are faced with a state where one does not have a sense of reverence which is of old or new. There's only a reverence, and it only actually sways with the direction that the rootless education takes us. So, because if one were to indeed think of Swaraj ideas, then there is a strong attempt to be made to avert and avoid rootless education. That is an active engagement that we ought to make in our current times and possibly in all times. So that is indeed a kind of engagement which can certainly enable us towards realizing Rama Rājya, because Rama was always firmly rooted in all that he did. And if one were to think of creating every person to embrace the ideal of Rama also, that sense of rootedness is necessary. So since Professor Bhattacharya wanted to elaborate on the sense of universalism, let us as well further see what he actually elaborates on this rootless sense. The other danger of national conceit and the unthinking glorification of everything in our culture and depreciation of everything in other cultures appears to me, in our circumstances, to require less stressing. I'm sure, say, there are many people who might find a little discomfort when say, one finds in the social media or in the newspapers where there's a specific reference that one finds that people are glorifying Indian, say, ancestors and Indian achievements of Indian ancestors, and that kind also staking claim to possibly such kind of say achievements which are possibly not our own. So I understand that, say, there is indeed a sense of naivety that is involved in it. But what Professor Bhattacharya says here is possibly something that one must indeed say pay careful attention to. The other danger of national conceit and the unthinking glorification of everything in our culture and depreciation of everything in other cultures appears to me, in our circumstances, to require less stressing. Not that it is less serious abstractly considered, but as a matter of fact, our educated men suffer more from over-diffidence than from overconfidence, more from a quote-unquote rootless universalism than from clinging particularism. This is possibly as true as it was in 1930s, late 1920s, 30s, as it is now, and probably even more. Not that it is less serious abstractly considered, but as a matter of fact, our educated men suffer more from over-diffidence than from overconfidence, more from a quote-unquote rootless universalism than from clinging particularism. We are more ready to accept others' judgments about us than to resent them. I'm sure, say, one would have pleasantly been happy to notice our External Affairs Minister assert that, irrespective of what the rest of the people would have to say about the state of democracy in the country, I'm self-assured, is the statement that he made in his most recent interview. So that sense indeed requires to be, say, reflected on. We are more ready to accept others' judgments about us than to resent them. There is the old immemorial habit of regarding what we are taught as sacred learning, and the habit is not easily altered, even though the learning imparted is the mere opinion of others. Opinion about us, for example, of men who might be presumed to be ignorant of us and unsympathetic to us. There is so much kind or unkind written about us and preached to us by others that raises the legitimate question, if they have a sufficient perception of the inwardness of our life. Prima facie, it is very difficult for a foreigner to understand the mind of a people from whom he is widely removed by tradition and history unless he has intimately participated in their life for a long time. And even that, after that also possibly it is not very easy. It is only natural that the people in question should receive his judgment about them with a certain amount of mental reserve. It might lead them to self-examination if the foreigner is not obviously ignorant and abusive, but docile acceptance is not certainly demanded in the first instance. I've already pointed to you about the story of the devil from Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses, where the devil's sole task is to describe. And if there's a docile acceptance of the devil's description, then what indeed it happens would be that one turns to sheep. So I'm pretty sure that, say, the mental reserve that is being called for can only come when one is self-assured, as our External Affairs Minister stated. And that sense of self-assurance is something that one must indeed build. Now, there is a good deal in the name of learning, history, philosophy, or moral sermon imparted to us through our education, which is unconsciously or consciously of a tendentious or propagandist character. I'm sure those who are teaching, say, textbooks in schools would actually find this more relevant because it hasn't actually altered. They imply a valuation of ourselves, an appraisement of our past history and present position from a foreign standard. This is as true and probably more true even to this day. And there is a desire in the national education policy to alter this. But where exactly does one start and how does one do? That indeed is in itself an exercise towards Swarajyan ideas. Our attitude towards them should be one of critical reserve and not of docile acceptance. There are two terms which are used, a mental reserve, then followed by critical reserve, not of docile acceptance. And yet the critical attitude would in many cases be condemned by our foreign teachers and by our own educated men as uncultured and almost as absurdly ignorant as a hesitation to accept the truth of geometry. That is inevitable where the education of a people is undertaken by foreign rulers or those who are under cultural subjection. I'm adding the latter one must consider in our current times. There is bound in such a case to be some imposition of foreign valuation on the learner and the discouragement of the critical attitude. The question of imposition does not arise in the case of certain branches of learning. By the way, if one carefully observes, it's only in the 23rd paragraph that there is a specific instance of the time when Professor Bhattacharya spoke is coming out, because he is speaking about the foreign rule, right? Till now, in none of the paragraphs would find that, say, the statements that he made was specific to the presence of a foreign rule. It actually can apply in all instances. The question of imposition does not arise in the case of certain branches of learning, mathematics and the natural sciences, for example, which have no nationality and imply no valuation. Today, of course, this particular statement is also something to be scrutinized with sufficient care, specifically because of the kind of image of mathematics and the image of the science that is actually presented. Because the sense of how to actually think mathematically need not be the way in which Ganita used to be probably done. There are instances and conscious efforts made by several thinkers and our own scholars who have tried to point out this distinction, and not just in terms of the sciences, but also in terms of technologies. So I've indeed referred to the name of Dharampalji earlier. apart from his work, one might as well notice the works of a group called Patriotic People-Oriented Science and Technology Foundation. We are fortunate that late Professor Navjyoti Singh, under who I studied, was a member of that group, and they have tried to make conscious effort to try and point out the distinction between traditional science and modern science, and also in what manners it actually gets to be different. So there is a reference that I can give in terms of the work of Professor C.V. Seshadri, whose formulation of how to look at the sense of thermodynamics itself can be a ground on which an entire new science can be erected. I cannot go in greater detail into this point, but the question of imposition does not arise in the case of certain branches of learning, mathematics and the natural sciences, for example, which have no nationality and imply no valuation, is true only insofar as, say, the instance where they do not claim to actually, say, present a sense of nationality or valuation. But today we do have several instances where people claim that this is Western science, so which indeed brings with it the sense of valuation. Whenever there is valuation, there is a suspicion of a particular point of view, national, communal, or racial, of the person who judges the value. So the claim of valuation is indeed happening in all spheres, and at a time when such a kind of valuation is occurring, and it indeed calls for a greater degree of critical reserve, a valuation of our culture by a foreigner from the standpoint of his own culture should be regarded by us as meant not for our immediate acceptance, but for our critical examination. It should be a fillip to which we should react. I remember a remark of Sir John Woodroffe. Sir John Woodroffe has translated many works of Indian Shastras into English. So one of his translations was on Kamakala Vilasa. It's a very fine translation that one finds. To this purpose, that our first impulse here should be one of self-defensive resentment, is only natural and need not imply an uncultured self-deceit. Docile acceptance without criticism would mean slavery. So in fact, if one does not provide, say, the self-defensive resentment of a foreigner having translated a core text of one's own, then it means that, say, there's something missing in terms of our critical reserve. Docile acceptance without criticism would mean slavery. The critical attitude is demanded preeminently in the field of valuation of ideals. Mere acceptance here makes not only for confusion, but for moral evil. But barring the concepts of the sciences, please note, even here, there may be some doubt. And that doubt indeed turned out to be true with the kind of efforts that we get to notice from PPST Foundation and others. All concepts and ideas have the distinctive character of the particular culture to which they belong. What should be our reaction to such cultural ideas? They have to be accepted, but the metaphors and symbols to be translated into our own indigenous concepts. The ideas embodied in a foreign language are properly understood only when we can express them in our own way. I plead for a genuine translation of foreign ideas into our native ideas before we accept or reject them. Let us everywhere resolutely think in our own concepts. It is only thus that we can think productively on our own account. There's actually a very simple exercise that one can as well place in front of us. Point which Professor Bhattacharya himself made at the beginning of his lecture. Can this very lecture be delivered in one's own language? Or for that matter, any kind of a text that we read in English or some other language that we know, can we actually express it in its without losing its bhava into our own language? That's a question that one can pose. And possibly the reverse is equally important, whether we can express what is in our own language, our own mother tongue, into English without losing its bhava. Because in current times, both senses of expression are actually getting intermixed. A sankara is happening, and that can only create confusion without ever creating a possible conflict that can lead to a deepening of the soul, which can possibly create a ground for the simplification and unification of ideals, which can then be raised to the level of the sense of universal. For that at all to happen, one must indeed have a description of what we do, what we experience in our own language without recourse to a foreign language. That becomes essential. I read this paragraph once again before we move to the final paragraph of this. The critical attitude is demanded preeminently in the field of valuation of ideals. Mere acceptance here makes not only for confusion but for moral evil. But barring the concepts of the sciences, even here there may be some doubt. All concepts and ideas have the distinctive character of the particular culture to which they belong. What should be our reaction to such cultural ideas? They have to be accepted, but metaphors and symbols to be translated into our own indigenous concepts. The ideas embodied in a foreign language are properly understood only when we can express them in our own way. I plead for a genuine translation of foreign ideas into our native ideas before we accept or reject them. Let us everywhere resolutely think in our own concepts. It is only thus that we can think productively on our own account. In politics, our educated men have been compelled to realize by the logic of facts that they have absolutely no power for good, though they have much power for evil, unless they can carry the masses with them. In other fields, there is not sufficient realization of this circumstance. In the social sphere, for example, they still believe that they can impose certain reforms on the masses, which still continues, by mere preaching from without, by passing resolutions in social conferences, and by legislation. In the sphere of ideas, there is hardly yet any realization that we can think effectively only when we think in terms of the indigenous ideas that pulsate in the life and mind of the masses. We condemn the caste system of our country, but we ignore the fact that we who have received Western education constitute a caste more exclusive and intolerant than any of the traditional castes. A very important recognition, I think, say this two lines I indeed want to read once again for your reflection. In the sphere of ideas, there is hardly yet any realization that we can think effectively only when we think in terms of the indigenous ideas that pulsate in the life and mind of the masses. We condemn the caste system of our country, but we ignore the fact that we who have received Western education constitute a caste more exclusive and intolerant than any of the traditional castes. Let us resolutely break down the barriers of this new caste. Let us come back to the cultural stratum of the real Indian people and evolve a culture along with them, suited to the times and to our native genius. That would be to achieve Swaraj in ideas. This last point which is actually made, if one were to come back to the cultural stratum of the real Indian people, this is delivered between 1928 to 1931. There are different versions. I am more likely to accept 1931 as the timeline. We have almost 90 years gap between when this was spoken of and what happens now. The cultural stratum of the real Indian people, about what it is and whether it has not actually had been impacted by the kind of reforms on the masses which were forced upon by legislation, or by matter of the kind of the exclusive caste of the Western educated elite, whether there hasn't been any kind of an impact on the cultural stratum of the real Indian people is something that would be a very hasty statement to make. Indeed, there has been a great degree of change, and the desires of the cultural stratum of the real Indian people have always tried to see that their own future is actually, if they are going to be part of that elite, so to receive the Western education, and this is a move that still continues. So even as, say, we sit here and discuss this point, the question remains that there are some strands of the cultural stratum that are still present, who are desirous of trying to be remaining with a critical reserve, and also have a sense of patriotic element in it, a sense of traditional commitment. And to put it in the Purna Pramati's language, there's a desire for, say, Parampara Bija Raksha that is still existent. And in the light of these, to actually recognize where we are and also take up the task that Professor Krishna Chandra Bhattacharya has called for is indeed desirable, not just for the sake of Swaraj ideas, but also to actually have that kind of ideal, which we can call ideal polity, which we can call as our own, which is Rama Rājya. And I'd stop this particular thing for a while, and if there are any questions, we'll take before I want to show you the specific reference to what Professor Ramchandra Gandhi had to say.
Thank you, Pranavji. Any questions?
No, I have a question.
Prabhanjana is asking.
Sorry, you know.
Yeah, Kusmaka, please go ahead.
My question is regarding.
Please go ahead.
This conflict is with all the young generation who are influenced by the tradition of India or the culture of India, while they appreciate some which are comfortable, which is also suitable to the modern life, and while they also feel connected emotionally to all their ancestral, or you can say the native cultural habits. But the challenge here for us is, if we refuse the assimilation, and if you refuse to take certain practically applicable thoughts of the ancestors, which says along with the times our habits should also change. If we do not take it, what can be the consequence? Would we end up in making it more useless of all the arguments that we make now, or would it be like people will just choose to make whatever is more comfortable for them?
To be honest, I do not expect that, say, common people would be the ones who would take a call on these. It would be specifically left to the leaders who would actually create such conducive conditions which make people to as well think about what to embrace and what not to. So the question of comfort as understood in general, and the embrace of whatever is comfortable, is to be expected by all means. So the question that is more important is whether this embrace of comfort, whether it also allows for ensuring that the space of one's own spiritual element, which has been distinguished from that of the embrace of whatever happens because of the change in times, that is also being maintained. So if the sense of education can indeed create that sense of doubt in people to try and force them towards a conflict, that is possibly the hope that one can actually say carry forth. There is no other thing that one can possibly say see as a point from where one can think of this coming to people otherwise. I hope that actually addresses the point that you are asking.
Well, what I foresee in that case is it's a very individualistic choice that the generation which is coming to make.
No, it will be a point where I said it has to start with the leadership, which is actually setting the parameters for individual choices and desires. There is a role for the individuals indeed, but there is also a role for the kind of atmosphere within which those choices and things are made. If at all the nature of leadership itself is indicative of making such kind of choices that would not want people to have this conflict in their minds.
I know what
which is what is more expected, which is what is a sense in which if one were to take a traditional sense, you would say that samsara should be such that it would make people forget about the critical questions that cause conflict.
I agree with your point, but my point is like the leader may have a commitment. The leader may have a vision to do so, but having given the challenges of things that have happened in the world so far, and the amount of effort that can be put by the leaders to bring about the change that you are foreseeing, I'm just wondering if again will it not come back to the individuals to decide upon it?
In the sense that individual is sovereign to actually make such choices, the answer is yes. There is that because every individual is responsible for whatever choices he or she makes. So in the end, it will of course have an element where the individual has a role to play, because we do take that each individual is being with Chetana. And he is not a Jada being. So he is not someone who is stayed, who is someone who does not have any sense of conscious liveness in the person. So, but before any of this kind can happen, the person should have the possibility for educating oneself of these questions that are there. So in the context of a rootless education, one wouldn't expect this to happen.
Yeah.
If one indeed has a kind of societal effort, or even a political or a conscious effort from the leaders to try and make the education, if not completely rootless, at least say to have glimpses of what roots look like, there is a possibility that one can that can actually create that choice for individual to think of. It exists even to this day, but whether it would be completely lost, it would never happen. But the key point would remain whether a critical mass of such kind of people can ever be expected to come together. And when a critical mass of such people who are who have the critical reserve develops, then it will become a force to reckon with in every instance. Is that something that we can foresee? Well, I think we should be optimistic about it.
Yeah. Thank you.
So there's one point it says, what if loyalty is understood as Rana than anything else? Well, I would take that formulation as something which is good, because Rana has a wide range of meanings that one can offer. But then Rana itself is not acceptable to somebody like a Charvaka. There is no Rana that they intend to carry or pay back. So the question of loyalty in all those people who come from religions is not an issue at all. In fact, we are quite happy to deal with religious people, specifically in those instances where people are also conscious of an obligation towards the society that they live in. There's no issue. So if we say that those people who are atheists or agnostics, they have an obligation towards the society that they live in, we can indeed say bring in that sense of loyalty there. So I guess say that's a point that I did not expand on. I left it for say further reflection because there are many senses in which one can construe how this loyalty towards one's own ideals can be made acceptable as a universal principle. There's this specific request from Prabhanjana on the article of Dr. Subramanya Swamy last year. I thought for that to come in itself, I wanted to bring to your attention the article by Professor Ramchandra Gandhi. With this, we'd actually say also address the key question that would make it a fertile ground for us to discuss the next, say, week's discussions on Pura Apinavam Puranam and the corresponding Purana Vairam, which is possibly, say, captured in our times. So here is the Swaraj of India, a reflection on the Swaraj in Ideas article by Professor Ramchandra Gandhi, who is grandson of Mahatma Gandhi and one of the foremost philosophers of post-independent India. He has tried to give what he would call as an Advaitin account of trying to look at the Swaraj of India. He has this very specific point to make that, say, if at all Swaraj in Ideas of Professor K.C. Bhattacharya has to be understood, then the Advaitin accounting that Professor K.C. Bhattacharya has given has to be appreciated. And he tries to speak of the same. And there are a few very important points that he actually makes in his accounting of how this unfolds. So I actually encourage people to read this. There are a few points that I thought I should bring to your attention on in terms of, say, what he says about one specific aspect, which I thought I should bring to your attention. See, the charge against K.C. Bhattacharya's specific, say, article. I also refer to Professor Rajendra Prasad's article where he refers to the call for reverence as a dignified traditionalism. So dignified traditionalism is something that need not be acceptable to those people who are actually embracing the sense of modernism. And there is a nativism charge against, say, K.C. Bhattacharya's plea for Swaraj in Ideas. And Professor Ramchandra Gandhi says that the sense of being native is actually that which is to be in that Advaitin state of the oneness with one's own self and thereby the entire cosmos. So that's a formulation that he has. And in fact, he has a very specific and important points to make about the sense of one thing that he calls for as to use his specific language. He speaks of a point somewhere. I'm reading out from the first page itself. British rule or modern industrial civilization and its imperialism and materialism, missionary Christianity and Islam and their soul lust, the self-contradictoriness and shame of Advaitin Hinduism's practice of untouchability, etc., are symbols and powers of illusion of not self, otherness, Maya. So please underline the specific reference that Professor Ramchandra Gandhi would like to bring to our attention about the sense of past that he indicates when he uses the expression the self-contradictoriness and shame of Advaitin Hinduism's practice of untouchability. Take this as first reference, and then I want to point you to the reference to the nativism and the effort that he actually tries to address it. Unfortunately, those who pejoratively shout nativism are not only not wary of the dangers listed above, constantly succumbing to them in high places. They have no notion at all of unfallen or regenerate or true nativism. For such a thing and truth there really is, and it is the highest truth and thing too. There is no need to abandon even the word nativism falsely, defensively, in favor of words of euphemism and growing respectability such as tradition, aboriginality, ethnicity, etc., because there is always greater hope for the fallen and abused than the secure and unharmed in language as in spiritual life. Take the word untouchable, vehicle in use of tragic, sinful disrespect of a whole category of human beings of our country even today, alas. Yet, savingly, ironically, the word quote-unquote untouchable itself truly designates Atman, which alone cannot be touched, seen, heard, etc., and is what each one of us really is. Thus, when we would be derisively call somebody an untouchable, we acknowledge him in perfection of phrase as Atman, and he deserves our obeisance and not ostracization. Untouchability will be defeated by the word quote-unquote untouchability. Likewise, narrowing unadventurous isolationism is overcome by nothing more effectively than by etymologically self-conscious quote-unquote nativism, which is loyal to what is most native to myself, selfhood and self-consciousness, one in and us and as all. So this is the position that Professor Ramchandra Gandhi takes. And if I indeed take the sense of untouchability in the desired sense of the altered meaning, because he says that there is always greater hope for the fallen and abused than the secure and unharmed in language as in spiritual life. We have an Article 17 in the Constitution of India, which says abolition of untouchability. And if that sense that Professor Ramchandra Gandhi is trying to work out is actually present in the sense in which he indeed speaks of, it's actually an abolition of Atman and the all the very good things that he intends to raise as part of his the Swaraj of India. So Dr. Subramanya Swamy, in his call for Rama Rājya, he has made a specific point where he intends to say that the Rama Rājya is present in the Constitution, and that Dr. Ambedkar is a great Rama Bhakta. We can talk about Rama Bhakta part later, but key point to notice is that so long as Article 17 in its current formulation read in conjunction with Ramchandra Gandhi's assertion goes, you cannot possibly have any sense of Rama Rājya imagined. So therefore, to use Professor K.C. Bhattacharya's word critical reserve, it is with the critical reserve that I would say that the statement about Constitution of India is indeed that when it is properly implemented would lead us to Rama Rājya is something that must be taken only with a pinch of salt. And regarding, say, Dr. Ambedkar and his Rama Bhakti, we can possibly say, look at it when we indeed come to the question of looking at annihilation of caste and such other works that he has actually written and propounded, which require due addressing specifically in the context of current times, where Dr. Ambedkar's word is taken to be nothing short of the word of God. So I think, say, at this moment, I'd like to say stop, and we take these things further in our next session by looking at the very notion of the old that can become equally new. Pura apinavam Puranam. So any questions and others, you can write to me. Prabhanjana, I hope you got your brief response.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Pranava Garu, for such an elaborative, descriptive, discussion on Swarajin ideas. If participants have any questions, please write to Pranavji and you can call him and discuss further. We shall meet next week with another set of ideas for a couple of more sessions. So with this, I conclude 8th session of the course Sense of Past towards Realizing Rāma Rājya. Hopefully we will meet next week and learn more on this topic. We'll end the session with a Shanti Mantra. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah, Sarve Santu Niramayah, Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu, Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Ram Ram.